So today, this time, we're going to be looking at the Moscow variation of the Sicilian, and it's a check with a bishop. And the character of this opening, by the way, is different than the Grand Prix we looked at. Generally speaking, this is the kind of line White plays if you want a solid, simple kind of game, which is not the Grand Prix attack, as you guys might have noticed, right? So this is different level of risk, a little bit safer, more positional. So this might be good to play if you're playing someone who loves sharp positions and just hates, like dry, solid positions. This would be the kind of opening you'd want to play against them, right? Or maybe it's just your style. Maybe you don't like sharp games, then if you want something simple and solid, this is good for you. Okay, perfect. Already open. And so by the way, this was not just an opening used by people who only want solid games. This is used by Anand against Gelfand in the World Championship match. So it's a strategical thing there. So it's hard to beat White in the system, right? So and that's pretty good when you have an opening where you're not going to lose very much, right? And Kasparov used to play this in simul's a lot as well. A very solid way of playing.
Didn't he play this in the USSR versus the World match, or the Kasparov versus the World match?
He did, yeah. He did. Yeah, it was famously played there too, and I think the reason he played it in that match was because he didn't want to lose to some miscalculation or some computer use or something like that, right? So okay, so anyway, I'm just gonna give a little introduction to there are different ways Black can respond to the check, by the way. So we need to look at all of them because it turns out they're all pretty reasonable. So first, let's get to the starting position. So instead of the Grand Prix, we're going to play Knight F3, like we're going to play an open Sicilian. But against D6, we now play this annoying little check. So Black has three possibilities, reasonable, that we're going to look at to block it. Obviously, Queen D7 is just stupid, right? But Bishop D7, Knight D7, and Knight C6 are all reasonable moves, and we'll have to look at all of them. So the first is Bishop D7, which we're going to look at. And I think this is one of the most natural moves for Black, right? Just bishop check, block with a bishop. You attack the bishop, so White can't just do anything. And against this, White should take. It's not necessarily forced. White can play a move like A4 here, but I think taking on D7 is the best way to go. And then after Queen takes D7, it's important to play C4 immediately, actually. And with this move, we're trying to set up a Maroczy bind, right? And you want to play this move immediately so that you can play D4 and Knight C3 and set the Maroczy bind. Now, you want to play C4 because if you play, for example, D4 here, right? Black can take, play Knight takes, and maybe Knight F6. And now if we play Knight C3 to defend the pawn, as we like to do, exactly, you got it. So because of that, we need to play C4 immediately. Now, an interesting thing here is that this does allow Black to play Queen G4. And Black actually does win a pawn here. It's just a simple fork, right? You cannot defend both E4 and G2. But it turns out that White gets a lot of compensation for the pawn there. And we're going to look at a game after this, showing how White can punish that. So in any case, C4 is good to play. And then D4. And so we set up this Maroczy bind. G6, Knight C3. And by the way, we're going to look at the Maroczy bind more in depth later because if you play 2 Knight F3, you're going to need a system against all Black's replies, right? So today we're only going to look at D6, and I've also included some information on 2 E6. But we're also going to look at Knight C6, the Rosalimo, and we're going to look at what to do against the hyper-accelerated dragon with 2 G6 also. Okay. You have a question?
Does Black play Bishop G7 right here?
So Bishop G7 is possible, and White would basically play the same thing with Bishop E3. But yeah, Bishop G7 is fine. But Knight F6 is what I looked at here. I don't think it makes too much difference. And now this H3 move is I think an important idea here. In the past, White has commonly just played castling, but Black's found a really annoying tactical resource in the form of this Queen E6 move. And it's very annoying because Black's fighting C4 and E4, and really the the only good thing white can do here is knight d5, but the problem is it allows black to get a nice position where you have a lot of compensation for the exchange. So black takes the pawn, you check, and take the rook, but black wins both of your center pawns, and your bind's kind of gone. And some high-level games here have mostly ended in draws, basically. So I'm not really confident that white's doing that well here. So I'd like to avoid this. Now, I could just go on the assumption that your opponent's not going to see queen e6, but I'm not going to play hope chess, so instead of that, I think you should play h3. And the reason behind this move is you will want to play bishop e3. Because if you play bishop e3 right away, it can be harassed by a black knight, right? So h3 is necessary to guard that square. It's better than f3 because we don't weaken the dark squares in the center quite so much. Now bishop g7, and now we play bishop e3. And white has a solid position, not anything crushing. I mean, you're really delaying the battle to a middle game where you have to be patient, try to make progress slowly. So like I said, a lot of this is, just depend on the psychology, right? One annoying thing for Sicilian players is that if you're black and you're playing a Sicilian, you're typically looking for a bloody fight, right? So this is not the kind of position you're looking for. So that's one really positive thing about this. All right, so first let's go back to that queen g4 variation and show you why that white has more than enough compensation. So queen g4, and we should just castle. And if black takes the pawn, now we play d4. So black has problems with development. Not only does black only have the queen out, but white's starting to play knight c3 and just develop more and more. It's very hard to defend black's position. Black should take on d4. It is hard to suggest anything here. Knight c6, white plays knight c3, followed by knight d5. It's tricky to play. And now white, plays a series of pretty nice tactics. Black brings the queen back to d7. His position looks safe enough, but now knight b5. And white already sets up a pretty nasty threat. What's white threatening here? Carter?
E7? Yeah.
E7?
Oh, knight C7.
Yeah, knight c7, right?
C7.
Yeah. Yeah, the fork of the rook, right? Since the queen's pinned.
Yeah.
So knight c6. So the queen's no longer pinned by the queen in a4. And now, what's that?
You can take the A pawn.
Then you pin your queen.
Yeah, if knight a7, then rook a7, right? So, and now bishop g5. This is nice. White wants to take the knight and then play knight b5, which then threatens knight c7 and knight b6. So a lot of nice tactics there, and it discourages g6 too because then he'd have that open e file and doubled f pawns, isolated d pawn. So black played a6, but by the way, the knight doesn't have to move since the rook is on a8. So white just plays knight d5 right away, threatening knight c7, knight b6. a6 is also weakening the b6 square. Black decided to play rook c8. It's already kind of hard to suggest anything. The problem with taking on d5 is that after white takes, if you move the knight, you lose the knight c7. So taking the knight wasn't an option anyway. So rook c8, but now we win this exchange. Now this fun little knight a7 move, exploiting the pin. I think the finish is really fun here. It's really surprising how badly white crushes. So white's trying to get a past B or C or A pawn. And now B takes A. Really, really clever move. So why can't black play king takes C8?
A7.
Well, A7, then the king goes to B7. Exactly, yeah. And now black can't stop A7 and A8. So that's a pretty amusing tactic there. So black played.
I'd be probably mad if that happened.
You'd be mad? I would too.
But can't black move knight F8 and then C?
No, you can't get
C7?
Yeah, the knight doesn't reach, so king takes C8, rook A B1. If you play knight D7,
No, F7.
F7.
I mean,
F8.
wait.
You mean e8?
Yeah, E8.
Okay, if black plays knight e8, let's see, what would be best? I think rook b7 might be interesting. Does that work? No, not quite. So I was thinking actually of taking and then playing rook b1, but
Then bishop.
I'm not sure this works. Yeah. Well, it might. I mean, the problem is if you play there, then there's a check. But I don't think it works because of d5 actually. And then once the bishop moves, it'll guard a8. But white doesn't have to be that drastic. You can play a7, knight c7, check. And what's one simple way? Probably just rook b1 followed by rook b7, queen. Bishop can't move, by the way. Yeah. But anyway, so he played bishop b7. Now knight b6, and a7 is unstoppable. So black resigned. I mean, you can play king b8, but you lose the bishop to knight d5. Right. So black is just dead here. So yeah, needless to say, this is just, you don't have to worry about losing your e4 pawn there. You get a lot of compensation. All right. So let's go back to the main line and let's just look at an example of how play might go. So again, we want to play h3 to stop the knight g4 move. And this game actually features the bishop g7 move that you suggested, right? So h3, we get castle, and black should trade. Now, it's good for black to trade pieces. If black didn't trade, you might consider playing knight de2, something like that. Can anyone explain to me why black would want to trade pieces here? It's not a tactical thing.
White has more space.
Exactly, yeah.
White has more space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. That's it. Yeah, when you don't have much space, white dominates the center. Exactly. You got it. All right.
That doesn't work ever.
So black trades and plays queen c6. Now, e6 is always a double-edged move to play in these positions. Now, on the one hand, d5 is weak for black, but if you play e6, d6 can be tricky to defend. So it's kind of a dicey move. And so typically in the Maroczy bind, white puts the rooks on c1 and d1, so white moves those active positions. So black managed to trade dark squared bishops, but one problem with that here is that the dark squares are weak for black, so white has a slightly more pleasant position.
I don't ever want to trade my dark square bishop when I play Sicilian.
and black makes kind of a tactical error here. Black's position was worse, but definitely not that bad. But now white gets pretty much a winning endgame. The c pawn is basically not easily defended here. The problem is you can't play b6 to defend it, and if you defend it with the rook, then white gets very active. So white just has too much activity here, basically. And we're not going to look at the whole thing in depth, but white ended up winning this.
Yeah.
All right. So that's basically the gist there. You want to play c4 as early as possible, and then play d4, get your Maroczy bind. Knight c3, h3, bishop e3, castle. So that's kind of setup of your pieces. Bring your rooks to c1 and d1. So does that make sense? So just know where to put your pieces, play an early c4, and you'll be fine, basically. Any questions on this bishop d7 line? All right. So now let's look at knight d7. Now knight d7 has been kind of topical. So people have gotten tired of how few winning chances they're getting as black in that bishop d7 line. So they've tried playing knight d7 instead to try to not exchange as many pieces, right? And a lot of people have been trying this against Carlsen especially. And actually Carlsen has had some difficulty with this knight d7 line. He lost to Veselin Topalov, for example, in an interesting game. So it does pose some challenge to us. But I think Nakamura actually with white has played the right way. So we're going to look at a couple of example games of his. He's had some good success with this line as white. So the first things first, we just get castled. Since we're under a threat, we might as well just keep developing. And now a6, putting the question to the bishop. Now we play this funky-looking move, bishop d3. Now, typically, you don't want to block the bishop on c1 like that. But here, the reason we're putting on d3 is we want to give ourselves time to play rook e1 and c3 and guard the e pawn. So to understand that, it's worth knowing why you don't want to play bishop e2. What's wrong with bishop b2? What would black play here? What's that?
Knight f3.
You knight f6, right?
Yeah.
And then which one?
Just to the G.
Knight g f6, right?
Yeah.
All right. Trying to, help you guys with the notating part, right? Okay. And the difficulty for white here is in guarding that e pawn conveniently. We don't really want to play d3 because it's passive. White's strategy is basically going to be like a Ruy Lopez. You're going to want to play c3 and d4, and so playing d3 is just passive since you'll have to waste a tempo playing d4 later. And knight c3 isn't what we're going to do because now we can't expand in the center and get that nice pretty pawn center with pawns on d4 and e4. So bishop d3 is the only way to maintain this. And like I said, we're going for this kind of Ruy setup where we tuck the bishop away to c2 and then play d4. All right, now knight f6, c3, bishop c2, and then rook e1, and white's getting ready to play d4. So we're kind of employing this Ruy Lopez-like strategy. All right, so let's look at a couple examples. First off, if black plays an early b5, it's good to know what to do because it can be annoying. So you could potentially just play c3 here, but if black plays b5 so early, it's actually good to play c4. It kind of takes advantage of that move being so early. Oh, wow, okay. And after takes, yeah, it sounds like a horror movie out there. And black's problem here is that white has this really nice diagonal for the bishop, but it's not easy to neutralize. So let's take a look at what can happen here. And unfortunately for black, this plan of f4 is very strong. It's like basically a Fischer-Sochi variation against a Najdorf. It's where white plays bishop c4. It gives black a lot of problems. We see this e5 and f5 combination. Very nice. Black castle. Now d takes e wouldn't work out well. White could play f takes e, and then if, for example, f takes queen h5 is good. And white has a fantastic position. So castles, but black's just left with a wrecked pawn structure. Got double d pawns. White has that powerful pawn at e6, and now white's basically winning. And yeah, the rest of this isn't too much interesting. But okay, so that was just b5. You want to play an early c4. Let's look at some nice Nakamura games. First one against Nippo Palmiachi, and let's see how he handled it. So c3, bishop c2, and rook e1. So if you play the Ruy Lopez as white, this all looked pretty natural. But so the purpose here is white wants to play, build this big pawn center with d4. Now black can take some actions against this, which he does with rook c8. And white does have a little bit of a problem because if you play d4, which has been played before, by the way, it doesn't work out well because black can take and play queen c7. And it's very annoying for white because your bishop's under attack and it's not easy to defend it. If you play knight c3, black plays b4. And if you play knight a3, black still plays b4. Very annoying. And if you just move your bishop to like d3, black can win material here too. How does black win material here?
Taking on e4.
Yeah, exactly. So black can play bishop e4, and if you take rook e4, it doesn't work because of queen c1, and black wins material. So that c file is a real problem. So d4 is not good now, but a4 does become better since the rook has left the a file. The a file would be white's white's domain. So b4, trying to keep it closed. And now a5 is an important idea. Gaining space, taking away b6 from the black knight or the black queen. Now d3. You still can't play d4 because of that queen c7 idea. So remember that. So we have to play d3 first. So white's just kind of slowly engineering the d4 move, and by the way, it may look like he's just dropping the pawn on d3, but there's a tactical reason behind it. Because after black takes, white can play c4, and that bishop doesn't have a whole lot of escape routes, does it? So black makes one, but white gets pretty nice initiative in return. And rook takes c3 is kind of cute. Of course, knight takes c3 loses to the typical smothered mate with queen b3, right?
Oh, smothered me.
So they'd probably be like.
So the rook can't be taken, and white basically ends up with this endgame with bishop against knight and extra pawn, so it's enough to win. And they played a bit of an endgame, but eventually he ended up converting. All right. So let's look at another example. Whoops, I just moved it. A game of Nakamura's against Grischuk, and this was in the Sinkefeld Cup.
So no c4 here.
What's that?
Naka didn't play c4 to that.
Oh yeah, in this game, no, it did. I don't think black got the bishop to b5 here, or
Right.
yeah. So again, we see the same a4, a5 move. So far, exactly the same game as against Nipu Hamiyachi. This time he plays queen c7. Again, not really necessary because this is just explicitly stopping d4. But before, black could have kept that in the works. So again, we end up with the exact same position: bishop on f4, h3, and then knight d2. Except this time, Naka changes his moves up. He plays knight c4 instead of before. I think he played bishop h2. So a little bit different, but this looks good too. And f4, and we finally begin this kingside assault. G4 is a nice example of restriction. G4 isn't so much about attacking the black king as it is just taking away f5 from the black knight. And here, bishop takes f2 was just a dumb decision by Grischuk. I think he was in time trouble. And Naka ended up with the two bishops and a great position here. And white has this winning endgame with that passed pawn on e7. And black finally resigned. Of course, if you take on c7, then rook f7 is, crushing, right? Black would have to give up the rook. All right, so going back to the opening. So again, your main idea is castle, bring the bishop back to d3, c3, bishop c2, and rook e1. So again, it looks very similar to kind of Ruy Lopez type position. And then Black may let you play d4, by the way. If black plays best, you can't play d4, but if your opponent plays something like e6, then d4 is going to be good. All right. But against rook c8, you have to be a little bit flexible in your plans and play this a4 idea. All right. So any questions on this line? One of the key things with the Moscow is being patient, not trying to rush things. It's not really an aggressive opening, so you're not going to have many crushing checkmating victories. All right. So now let's move on to knight c6. Now I think knight c6 is in a way is really the least intuitive move here, and it is the least common. It most commonly occurs via a different move order, actually, when black plays knight c6 and then d6 after bishop b5. So there's some transposition from Rosalimo happening here. But in any case, it's pretty simple for white. You just go ahead and castle, keep developing. And bishop d7, rook e1. It, again, should look pretty similar to the knight d7 line. And we're going to aim for something pretty similar with the same Ruy Lopez setup with c3. We'd like to play d4. Now this time we bring the bishop back to f1. It's also possible to put the bishop on d3, but f1 is a better square for the bishop. It's easier for us to play d4 that way. And now bishop g4. Bishop g4 isn't forced, by the way. Black could play something like e5, and then after h3 and d4, it's almost identical to Ruy Lopez, really. The only difference being that perhaps black hasn't played b5. So bishop g4 isn't the only move, but it's probably the best because this is the only move that doesn't let white just expand in the center. And that's because if you play d4 now, black can take on f3 and ruin your pawn structure, right? Queen f3 would lose the pawn on d4, so you have to take back with a g-pawn. So h3 is the most common here, and it basically forces black to give up the bishop for some tactical reasons. If black plays bishop h5, you can play g4 and d4. It's a nice idea to remember. You're taking advantage of the fact that you have this queen a4 trick to win the material. So let's say, for example, black plays bishop takes e4. You can take and play d5. And the point being that if you move the knight, we have this queen a4 trick at the end. And it doesn't matter if black takes with the knight either. It's the same idea, d5, and then rook e4 and queen a4. In any case, we end up with a middle game which is very good. If you didn't know this, then you know now that in the middle game, 2 pieces is way better than a rook and a pawn. It's pretty simple. It's basically because rooks don't really commonly have open lines in the middle game, so they're just at a big disadvantage. And here is a great case of that. It's a very closed position. Both black rooks are pretty useless. It's a position where minor pieces are what you want to have. Okay, and there's only one other line to look at after g4, really. It's if black takes and plays d5. But you basically end up with a really active Isolani position. You can take, play knight c3, and bishop g2. The threat of knight e5 is just really strong, and even works well tactically. If black plays bishop e4, well, I'll let you guys figure it out. So white to play, what should white do here? Eric? Yeah, knight h. Well, no, never mind. I was getting ahead of myself. Knight h4, black plays bishop takes g2, and then after knight takes, black can play knight takes d4 or queen takes d4. Yeah, rook e4, queen takes. Yeah, and what's going on there? Why is white winning? Yeah, so what's a safe square the queen can go to? Can't go to g6, covered by the knight. Can't go to f4. You could take d4, but then that loses to. Yeah, the queen's hanging. So rook takes knight e5, and the only safe square is d4, but then bishop takes is very painful. And by the way, knight h4 works too. That's why I said I was getting ahead of myself, because queen d4 also loses to bishop takes c6. All right, so yeah, white just has a great position in that case. So after h3, to avoid g4 and d4, black basically has to take it. And after queen takes, we have a very nice upcoming middle game for white. White has the two bishops, and will slowly kind of try to expand the center. So it's very, very pleasant for white to play. Amongst all the lines we've looked at, knight d7 and bishop d7, I think this would be the easiest to play for white, in my opinion. I think it's any position where I can get two bishops for nothing, I feel like is a win for me. So, all right. So let's look at an example game here. And this was between Howell and Sutovsky. So first things first, we play d3 and then bishop e3. Later on, we can play d4, maybe f4. It kind of depends on your opponent's reaction. Queen hides from a possible knight e5. And black plays e5 here, kind of discouraging both d4 and f4. Playing f4 would be too early here since it would open up some squares for the knights and the bishop on g7. So white just plays patient here, g3. So white has two bishops and the better pawn structure now. Now knight e3 is actually pretty devastating. And of course can't take on g3 because of knight d6. And so now white's won a piece, and the rest isn't really interesting. Yeah, rook e7, pretty devastating threat. So again, the main thing here was being patient, not forcing anything. Going back to the opening, one of the key parts of white's strategy here was making that bishop better by playing g3 and bishop g2. That was an important idea. So patience is a big thing here. All right, so let's look at another. This is a little bit more interesting example. So again, bishop e3, knight d2, and usually the queen goes to e2 or d1 after it's harassed or before it's harassed by a knight. In this case, he chose d1. And so instead of going for an f4 idea, he opted for trying for just d4 with knight f3. And so white has this really nice pawn center. And the bishop on f1 targets the queen side with this weak pawn at a6. And already black's in a tough spot after rook b7. One problem you have is that if you play knight f6, that runs into d5, and white wins the e7 pawn. So he tried to hold on to everything with knight b8, but that's just too passive. White threatens bishop c4. Now we can take f7 because of this knight g5 trick. And now black just resigned. Knight f7, basically not something we can stop. All right. So any questions about the stuff we've looked at so far? Again, the plan here is pretty simple. So let's go back to the opening. You castle, play rook e1, c3, bishop goes to f1. h3. Pretty much you want to play h3 even if black doesn't play bishop g4. For example, if black played g6, h3 would still be right because you want to prevent bishop g4. Then if black were to play bishop g7, now you can play d4, right? Or if black plays bishop g4, force black to exchange the bishop, play d3, bishop e3, knight d2. And then you have several strategies. You can wait and improve your position on the king side, play g3, bishop g2, or you can play queen z1, knight f3, and go for d4. So those are your plans there. Okay. So let's look at e6 too. Now, one of the annoying things, if you spend a lot of time studying the Moscow and Rosalimo, is that black can just play 2e6. He doesn't have to play knight c6 or d6. So it's good to have a plan against this. And I like this move 3g3. Now it is different compared to the spirit of bishop b5. You're cutting the bishop, right? But you have to be flexible. I mean, if black plays against your light squared bishop with moves like e6 and a6, then there's no reason for you to put it over there. So I like this g3 move. And by the way, this has been a popular choice with Carlsen. He's had a lot of good success with it. He played it in the second World Championship match against the Nons, and he also crushed Caruana in a nice game with it. He's had some good success with it. So let's check this line out. So first thing after d5, e5 is possible. You kind of transpose to a King's Indian attack, but I rather like this idea of taking and playing d4. White's trying to give black an isolated queen pawn here, so it's a nice kind of stable advantage to play with. And by the way, we're following a nice game from Luke McShane and James Jackson. If you remember the last time, I think we looked at a Grand Prix game from his. I mentioned how he's like the world's strongest amateur, right? Because he's like a full-time banker, even though he's like over 2,700, or at least he was. I don't think he's that anymore. So white's giving up the two bishops, but in return, he has this easy target on d4 and good squares for his pieces. Now, his knight e1 move is instructive. The knight is just going to be really well placed on d3. It guards b2, and it stops the d4 pawn. So white gets back one of the bishops at least. Rook e2 may seem strange. One of the ideas is to guard b2 so that if bishop takes, now c takes would guard b2 through the rook and queen on d2 and e2. Now white has this nice tactic to finish off with queen d2. Problem is white's threatening queen h6, and white's threatening queen takes a5, and unfortunately can't stop both. So black took. But for example, if you play knight c6, you take queen h6, and if queen g7, we have this nice rook e8 move, right?
Yes.
And we win the queen. So black has to give up the piece, but from then on, it's just not really any hope, right? Okay. So let's look at another example, and this time is actually a blitz game, a playoff. I forget what tournament this was.
It was Bilbao,
Yeah, so Bilbao. I couldn't remember if that was the location of the tournament. I guess maybe it's both. So this was a blitz game. So not a long game. So not Caruana's best effort, but it's interesting to see what happened. So we see e6, g3, now b6. So this game is a good example too of being flexible. So bishop g2, bishop b7, and queen e2. And this is nice because it keeps open the option of playing d4, which after d6, it's a good idea. So we have this possibility of setting up a Maroczy bind. And Carlsen also shows some very sneaky tactics. So after a6, he plays this really killer e5 move. It's a really sneaky tactic. We're exposing an attack on the bishop. And the point is, after bishop takes g2, we play e takes f6. and white's just crushing. Basically, the point is the threat of knight takes e6 is just devastating. So if black plays, for example, bishop b7, knight takes e6, take, queen e6, right? Black has to play something like bishop b7, and now white has probably several ways to win, but the easiest is just taking on g7. and we win the rook, right? So that's just a killer tactic, really sneaky. And bishop h3 may look like it works, but now white has queen h5. And it turns out the bishop has no square, basically. If you play bishop f5, white would just take, and now rook e1 is game over. And the game, Caruana just sacrificed a piece, but now he's just down a piece for nothing against Carlsen, so that didn't last very long. So I really like this game. Really sneaky idea to keep in mind. So
did he have anything better than taking bishop on g2?
no, after e5, white's basically just winning here.
Wow.
You can't even play something like knight d5 because c4 and the knight can't move. Yeah, really, really crazy. So that's an idea worth remembering, is that if black plays b6 and d6 here with e6, then it's good to play an early d4. And you can go with this sneaky castle and rook d1 idea of Carlsen's. I mean, I bet you trick a lot of people doing this. In fact, when I saw this game, I immediately tried the same thing in a tournament like the next week, and somebody fell for it. It's pretty funny how that works. But
Was that blitz or standard?
no, it was a standard game, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So it's funny how you can repeat these things. And this isn't even hope chess, because this is actually, principles and good for white. If black doesn't fall for it and plays like queen c7, then you can play c4 and go for the Maroczy bind. So you're not really playing hope chess, but playing a sneaky line. And yeah, I included the World Championship for you guys to review. I'm actually not going to go over it in class, but it'll be interesting to look at. This was from, was it the second match? Yeah, second match in 2014. This was one in Sochi. So I think it's this definitely must be a nice line, since Carlsen did play in the World Championship match. So it's worth looking at.
You mean the World Championship match where they actually played sharp openings?
Yeah. Unlike the Karyakin Carlsen match. Yeah, this Anand match was actually very interesting. So anyway, so that's today. We covered 2 d6 and 2 e6, and then next time we're going to look at 2 knight c6, and we're going to look at 2 g6. Now, especially, I think it's important for us to cover 2 g6 because a local master, Daniel Fernandez, he teaches his students to play the hyper-accelerated dragon. So I don't know if you guys have played as students, but I know they all play the hyper-accelerated dragon. So I've looked at some people's games, and I see a huge number of those.
So it's time to learn the Maroczy bind in detail.
Exactly, yeah.
Time to learn c4.
Yeah, so some spoilers. My recommendation is going to be to play the Maroczy bind, right? And the biggest reason is percentage.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like in chess base, I see white scores 58%, which is way above, typically in a good opening, you'll see 53, 54% score. And considering it's 58, I think you guys, should definitely be playing that.
I went through my hyper-accelerated dragon phase until I was disabused of that notion by the Maroczy bind.
Yeah, just I'll look at one more thing here. There's one other thing you guys should know. So e4, c5, knight f3. There's one interesting move. I'm not sure if you guys know what the best thing to do against it is. It's 2 a6. Okay. It has it's the O'Kelly variation. It turns out it's pretty dubious. It's not losing. It's just not good. Now, what do you guys think white should do here? Black's idea, by the way, is to avoid the Moscow variation by virtue of white playing d4 and then knight f6. And point number one is that if you play e5, queen a5 wins the pawn. But if you play knight c3, then black can play d6, and he's suddenly playing a knight orf, and you didn't even have the option of playing the Moscow, or he could play like e5 even. e5 is fine too. So anyway, playing d4 isn't that special. So any other suggestions?
Is it like one move that makes it really not good for black?
I mean, basically, yeah. One move gives like a clear advantage. I mean, by the way, one option which is definitely fine is to play c4.
Yeah, I thought about that, but it's not as good because B5.
You play Maroczy bind. Well, b5 looks. I think White would win the pawn and be happy with that. But it is just a Maroczy bind, and in the Maroczy bind, a6 is useful. So it wouldn't even be a good Maroczy bind. It would just be Maroczy bind, which is still good. But White has an even stronger move.
Is it B?
Oh, b3 is okay. E5. Generally, you don't want to play e5 very early if you're not attacking the knight. It turns out the best move here is c3. And basically, we have an Alapin variation up a full tempo. In the Alapin, knight f3 is extremely useful. We always play that move. But a6 is almost never played in the Alapin. It's just not useful in that opening. So Black's played this wasted move, and you play knight f3. So we have the extra tempo. It may not seem that useful, but it's actually more useful than you might think, because even b6 can be a problem for Black in some lines. Now, the first point is that if Black plays knight f6, White can just play your typical Alapin lines, and it's pretty good. And the other point is that if Black tries the other main line of d5, after you take, you can play this knight a3 idea. And in this line, a knight arriving on c4 is actually very strong. That b6 square is really weak. Already White threatens this nasty knight b6 possibility. So a move like e6, we would just lose the rook, right? So yeah, c3 is really good. So that's one solution to that. And like I said, next time we'll look at knight c6 and g6.
Yeah.
All right.